Millionaire CEO fell for his new employee, not knowing she was the daughter of his family's worst enemy. Victoria's hands trembled as she touched her father's photo one last time before sliding it into her briefcase. 20 years of planning, of becoming someone worthy of walking into Whitman Industries, all led to this moment. She had no idea that in 3 hours, the man she came to destroy would make her heart skip a beat with nothing more than a genuine smile. Before we dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is over there. Drop it in the comments below. It always amazes me how far these stories travel, from the US to Canada, the UK, Africa, and beyond. And while you're here, don't forget to hit subscribe and give this video a like so you won't miss the next story. Now, let's get started. The scent of fresh coffee and ambition filled the 42nd floor of Whitman Industries as Victoria Sterling stepped off the elevator. She dressed carefully. Navy blouse that conveyed professionalism without submission, black slacks that said she meant business, and the pearl earrings her mother had worn to every important occasion before the Whitmans destroyed their lives. Ms. Sterling, a blonde receptionist with a smile too bright to be genuine, looked up from her desk. "Mr. Whitman is ready to see you now." Victoria's stomach clenched. She'd practiced this moment 1,000 times in the mirror, but now that she was here, the weight of her father's memory pressed against her chest like a stone. James Sterling had been a good man, a contractor who built homes with pride and treated his workers like family. Until the Whitmans decided his minority-owned business was taking too many contracts from their development projects. The false accusations of substandard materials had come first. Then the frivolous lawsuits that drained his savings. Finally, the whispered campaigns that destroyed his reputation until no bank would lend to him. No client would hire him. Victoria had watched her father wither from a confident man who sang while he worked into someone who stared at unpaid bills with hollow eyes. "Right through those double doors," the receptionist chirped. Victoria straightened her shoulders and walked forward, each step a promise to the man who died believing he was a failure. "I'm going to make them pay, Daddy. All of them." The office beyond those doors stole her breath, not with its obvious wealth, though the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay were stunning, but with its unexpected warmth. Instead of the cold corporate shrine she'd imagined, she found walls lined with bookshelves, a reading corner with worn leather chairs, and jazz playing softly from hidden speakers. Framed photos showed not just business achievements but moments of genuine joy. A man laughing with construction workers, cutting ribbons at affordable housing projects, presenting oversized checks to local schools. "Ms. Sterling." The voice was deeper than she'd expected, warmer. Victoria turned and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Christopher Whitman wasn't the entitled golden boy she'd pictured. His brown hair held just enough gray at the temples to suggest wisdom earned, not inherited. His suit was expensive but not flashy, tailored to a frame that spoke of weekend hikes rather than boardroom battles. But it was his eyes that undid her careful preparation. Dark brown and completely focused on her face, not scanning her body like so many men in power did. "Please, sit wherever you're comfortable." He gestured to the conversation area rather than the intimidating desk. "Coffee. Water. I think I saw some of those fancy macarons in the break room if you're brave enough to trust our office manager's taste in French pastries." Despite herself, Victoria smiled. Coffee would be perfect. As he moved to pour from a small machine in the corner, not summoning an assistant but doing it himself, she noticed how he moved with careful precision, like someone aware of taking up space in the world. Nothing like the entitled swagger she'd expected from a Whitman. "So," he said, settling across from her with his own cup, "tell me why you want to work here. And please, skip the part where you tell me how much you've always admired our company. I've heard that speech 12 times this week, and we both know our reputation isn't exactly sunshine and rainbows." The honesty hit her like a physical blow. She'd prepared to hate him, to see through false charm and corporate speak. She hadn't prepared for someone who acknowledged his family's flaws with quiet shame shadowing his features. "I believe in second chances," she heard herself say, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. Sometimes the best way to honor the past is to build a better future. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe recognition. That's not what I expected you to say. What did you expect? Something about leveraging synergies and maximizing stakeholder value. His laugh was self-deprecating. I've been interviewing corporate lawyers all week. You're the first person who's mentioned the future mattering more than quarterly reports. Victoria studied his face, searching for the calculation she knew must be there. The Whitman manipulation her father had described. Instead, she saw exhaustion around his eyes, the kind that came from carrying burdens alone. Your resume is impressive, he continued, flipping through the carefully crafted document that contained not a single lie but omitted the most important truth. Harvard Law, top of your class, 3 years with Morrison and Associates. But you're here interviewing for a position that's honestly beneath your qualifications. Why? Because I need to be close enough to destroy you. Because sometimes the right opportunity isn't about the title on your business card. He leaned back, considering her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. What do you know about what we're trying to do here? Not the corporate website version, the real version. Victoria had researched Whitman Industries for years, looking for weaknesses to exploit. What she'd found confused her. Under Christopher's leadership, the company had shifted focus from pure profit to sustainable development. They'd started scholarship programs, funded community gardens, even established a foundation to help minority-owned businesses secure contracts. You're trying to be different than you were, she said carefully. Then we were, he corrected. And it's not easy. Every decision gets scrutinized by people who remember the old Whitman Industries. Every partnership gets questioned. Sometimes I wonder if we'll ever outrun our own shadow. The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. This wasn't the monster she'd prepared to face. This was a man genuinely struggling with inherited guilt, trying to build something better from the ruins of his family's reputation. But you keep trying anyway, she observed. What else can you do? His smile was sad but determined. The people my grandfather hurt deserved better. The communities my father ignored deserved better. I can't change the past, but I can damn well try to do better moving forward. Victoria's chest tightened. Every word he spoke made her mission both easier and infinitely more complicated. Easier because his obvious guilt confirmed her father's stories of Whitman cruelty. More complicated because the man sitting across from her seemed genuinely committed to making amends. I'd like to offer you the position, he said, extending his hand. If you want it. His palm was warm, slightly rough, hands that had held more than just pens and contracts. As their fingers touched, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The dangerous flutter of possibility, of connection with someone who might actually understand the weight of trying to honor the past while building something new. This changes nothing, she told herself as she shook his hand, ignoring how right it felt. He's still a Whitman. They still destroyed everything Daddy worked for. But looking into Christopher's eyes, feeling the unexpected spark between them, Victoria realized her carefully laid plans had just encountered their first major complication. The man she'd come to destroy might be the first person in years who truly saw her. Welcome to Whitman Industries, Victoria, he said, and the way he spoke her name, like it mattered, like she mattered, sent warmth spreading through her chest. She squeezed his hand once before letting go, her father's voice echoing in her memory. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who makes you forget they're the enemy at all. Have you ever met someone who challenged everything you thought you knew about them? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes the people we're meant to hate surprise us the most. 3 weeks into her employment at Whitman Industries, Victoria had fallen into a dangerous rhythm. Morning coffee with Christopher had become routine, not because he demanded it, but because he'd casually mentioned enjoying their conversations about everything from legal precedents to the best Ethiopian restaurants in the city. She told herself it was strategic, getting close to the target. Her racing pulse when he laughed at her jokes suggested otherwise. The catalyst came on a rain-soaked Thursday afternoon when Victoria was working late, poring over old company files in the legal archives. She'd volunteered for the tedious task of digitizing decades of contracts, knowing it gave her access to documents that might contain evidence of the conspiracy that destroyed her father's business. Her fingers trembled as she opened a manila folder marked Sterling Construction, 1999 to 2003. There it was, in black and white, internal memos discussing market consolidation strategies and competitor neutralization protocols. But as she read deeper, her blood turned to ice. The handwriting on several key documents wasn't from Christopher's grandfather, as she'd assumed. It was newer, fresher. The dates made her stomach lurch. Some were from just 5 years ago, long after the old man had died. These weren't historical sins. They were recent, deliberate attacks on small businesses that threatened Whitman Industries' dominance. And the signature at the bottom of the most damning memo, authorizing false complaints to the Better Business Bureau and coordinated contract interference, was unmistakably Christopher's. Victoria's vision blurred as she stared at the evidence. Her father hadn't just been destroyed by ancient Whitman greed. He'd been deliberately targeted by the man who'd been holding her hand and making her laugh for 3 weeks. The man who'd looked into her eyes and spoke about making amends while simultaneously orchestrating the systematic destruction of people just like her father. Victoria! Christopher's voice from the doorway made her jump. I saw the lights on. You've been here past 10 every night this week. She quickly closed the folder, but not before he caught her expression. In that moment, she saw something flicker across his face. Recognition, maybe calculation. Had he known who she was all along? Had this whole thing been some elaborate game? Just catching up on the old files, she managed, her voice surprisingly steady. Find anything interesting? The question seemed casual, but there was something in his tone that hadn't been there before. Something watchful. Just the usual corporate evolution, she lied, sliding the folder under a stack of other documents. Amazing how different the business practices were back then. Christopher moved closer, and for the first time since meeting him, Victoria felt truly afraid. Not of physical danger, but of the possibility that every smile, every shared coffee, every moment when she'd felt seen and understood, had been an elaborate manipulation by someone who'd been 3 steps ahead the entire time. The past is complicated, he said softly, his eyes never leaving her face. Sometimes context matters more than the bare facts. Does it? The words came out sharper than she intended. Because some facts seem pretty straightforward to me. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and growing tension. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized how isolated they were. Alone in the archives, 40 floors above the empty Seattle streets, with no one knowing she was here. Victoria. He said her name differently now, like he was testing how it tasted with suspicion. Is there something you want to ask me? The question hung in the air like a challenge. She could feel the weight of her father's photo in her briefcase, the years of careful planning, the promise she'd made at his grave. But she could also feel the tremor in her hands, the way her chest tightened at the thought that Christopher Whitman might be exactly the monster she'd originally believed him to be. I should go, she said, gathering her things with forced calm. It's late. But as she moved toward the door, Christopher stepped into her path, not blocking her exactly, but making it clear the conversation wasn't over. I meant what I said about second chances, he said, his voice low and intense. But they have to go both ways. If there's something you need to know, something you need to ask me, now would be the time. Victoria looked up into his eyes, searching for the warmth she'd grown accustomed to. Instead, she found something harder, more calculating. The mask was slipping, and underneath it was the Whitman legacy she'd expected all along. Good night, Christopher, she said, pushing past him toward the elevator. As the doors closed between them, Victoria caught her reflection in the polished steel. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with the shock of betrayal. She'd let herself forget the most important lesson her father's death had taught her. When it comes to the Whitmans, trust is a luxury that gets people destroyed. The elevator descended through 40 floors of steel and glass built on other people's broken dreams, and Victoria Sterling began planning her real war. What would you do if you discovered the person you were falling for was responsible for your deepest pain? Sometimes the cruelest betrayals come wrapped in kindness. The next morning arrived gray and bitter, matching Victoria's mood as she sat in her apartment staring at photocopies of the damning documents spread across her kitchen table. She'd barely slept, her mind churning between rage at Christopher's deception and a nagging voice that whispered she might be missing something crucial. Her phone buzzed with a text from him. "Coffee this morning? I brought those blueberry scones from the place you mentioned." The casual familiarity of it made her stomach twist. How could he act so normal when he'd systematically destroyed her father's life? She typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on, "Busy today. Rain check." At Whitman Industries, Victoria threw herself into research with renewed fury. If Christopher thought he could manipulate her with charm while hiding his crimes, he was about to learn what a Sterling looked like when they stopped playing nice. She requested access to more archived files, claiming she needed to understand historical precedent for current cases. But the deeper she dug, the more confused she became. The pattern didn't make sense. The documents she'd found were damning, yes, but they existed in isolation. Christopher's other decisions during the same period showed consistent efforts to support small businesses. Loan guarantees, partnership programs, even personal interventions when competitors tried to undercut minority-owned contractors. "You've been avoiding me." Christopher appeared in her office doorway around noon, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression she couldn't quite read. "I told you I was busy." Victoria didn't look up from her computer screen. "Busy enough to skip lunch with the Whitman Industries team? You know that's the contract that could make or break our Q3 numbers." She had forgotten. Completely. The meeting she'd been preparing for all week had slipped her mind entirely as she spiraled deeper into her investigation. "I can reschedule," she said, finally meeting his eyes. "Already did." He stepped into her office and closed the door behind him. "Victoria, what's going on? Yesterday you were laughing at my terrible jokes about maritime law. Today you won't even look at me." The concern in his voice sounded genuine, but she'd thought everything about him was genuine. "Maybe I just realized I don't know you as well as I thought." "Then ask me." He sat down across from her desk, leaning forward with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite everything. "Whatever you think you've figured out, whatever's making you look at me like I'm the enemy, just ask me." Victoria's hands clenched in her lap. This was it. The moment she could confront him with the evidence, watch his careful facade crumble, and finally get the justice her father deserved. But looking into his eyes, she found herself afraid of what she might see there. "Sterling Construction," she said quietly. "James Sterling. Ring any bells?" The change in Christopher's expression was immediate and devastating. Color drained from his face as recognition hit him like a physical blow. He sat back in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles went white. "Oh God," he whispered. "Sterling. James Sterling. You're—" His voice broke. "Victoria, you're his daughter." The raw anguish in his voice caught her off guard. This wasn't the reaction of someone caught in a lie. This was the reaction of someone realizing they'd been living in a nightmare they hadn't even known existed. "Did you know?" she demanded. "When you hired me, when you've been having coffee with me every morning, did you know whose daughter I was?" "No." The word came out strangled. "No, I swear to you, I had no idea." "Victoria, if I had known." "What? You would have done things differently? You wouldn't have hired me." Her voice rose, 3 weeks of buried pain finally breaking free. "Or you would have been more careful covering your tracks." Christopher flinched as if she'd slapped him. "What tracks?" "Victoria, I don't understand what you think. I found the memos." She pulled out photocopies of the documents, throwing them across the desk between them. "Your signatures, Christopher. Your handwriting. Instructions to file false complaints, to interfere with contracts, to systematically destroy small businesses that competed with yours. He picked up the papers with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the damning evidence. But instead of the guilty panic she expected, confusion creased his features. "These dates," he said slowly. "Victoria, these are from 5 years ago. I know exactly when they're from. My father died 6 years ago, after you spent months destroying everything he'd built." Christopher looked up at her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it took her breath away. "Victoria, 5 years ago I was in rehab." The words hit her like cold water. "What?" "5 years ago I was in a residential treatment facility in Montana, dealing with the fact that I'd nearly drunk myself to death trying to cope with taking over this company." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I wasn't making business decisions. I wasn't even in Seattle. I was learning how to get through a day without a bottle of whiskey." Victoria stared at him, her carefully constructed narrative beginning to crack. "But these are your signatures. They're forgeries." He set the papers down gently, as if they might explode. "Good ones, but forgeries. Victoria, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I didn't know about your father. I didn't know what happened to him. But I think I know who did." The office fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of Seattle traffic 40 floors below. Victoria felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, everything she believed about to crumble beneath her feet. "My uncle," Christopher continued, his voice hollow. "Richard Whitman. He's been managing certain aspects of the business, handling what he calls competitive intelligence. I thought it meant market research and legal analysis." He laughed bitterly. "I've been so focused on the legitimate parts of the company, I never looked closely at what he was doing in my name." "You expect me to believe you had no idea?" But even as she said it, Victoria remembered the photos in his office, the genuine guilt in his voice when he talked about making amends, the exhaustion around his eyes that spoke of battles fought on multiple fronts. "I expect you to hate me," he said quietly. "Whether I knew or not, it happened under my name. Your father. God, Victoria. Your father died thinking I was the monster who destroyed his life. And you've been sitting across from me every morning, drinking coffee and laughing at my jokes, not knowing I was the reason your family lost everything." Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in years burned behind Victoria's eyes. He was a good man. He built houses for people who couldn't afford anyone else. He treated his workers like family. "I know." Christopher's voice cracked. "I've been researching him since you said his name. James Sterling had a reputation as one of the most honest contractors in the city. The complaints against him came from anonymous sources. The contract disputes all traced back to shell companies that—" He stopped, running his hands through his hair. "That I now realize probably belonged to my uncle." Victoria watched him piece together the truth in real time, saw the moment when the full weight of what had been done in his name hit him. The devastation on his face was so complete, so genuine, that her anger began transforming into something more complicated. "I can't give you back your father," he said, meeting her eyes with a courage that must have cost him everything. "I can't undo the damage that was done in my name. But Victoria, I swear to you, I will find every piece of evidence, expose every lie, and make sure the whole world knows that James Sterling was destroyed by people who were supposed to answer to me." "And then what?" she whispered. "What happens then?" Christopher looked at her with eyes that held no hope, only a desperate need to somehow make things right. "Then maybe you'll be able to look at me without seeing the man who killed your father. Even if that man was me all along." The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of pain and the dangerous possibility of something that might, eventually, look like forgiveness. Victoria realized she was at a crossroads that would define not just her mission, but the rest of her life. When someone you're falling for turns out to be connected to your deepest trauma, do you choose justice or the possibility of healing together? Victoria didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table until dawn, staring at the documents that had turned her world upside down, Christopher's words echoing in her mind. By the time she arrived at Whitman Industries the next morning, she'd made a decision that terrified her. She was going to help him find the truth, even if it destroyed them both. "I need to see everything," she told Christopher when she found him in his office, looking like he hadn't slept either. "Every file, every contract, every decision your uncle made in your name. If we're going to do this, we do it right." Christopher nodded, relief and determination warring in his expression. "Richard keeps his own files in the executive suite. But Victoria, if we're caught going through them without authorization, then we better not get caught." They spent the morning in careful preparation, waiting until Richard Whitman left for his usual Thursday lunch meeting with the City Planning Commission. Christopher's hands shook as he used his master key to open his uncle's office, the betrayal of family trust clearly costing him. "He raised me after my parents died," he said quietly as they rifled through filing cabinets. "I trusted him with everything." Victoria found the first smoking gun in a folder marked Competitive Analysis 2018 to 2020. Inside were detailed dossiers on dozens of small contractors, including a thick file on Sterling Construction. Her father's photo stared back at her, a professional headshot from his company website, now marked with red ink notes about vulnerability points and leverage opportunities. "Chris." Her voice came out strangled. "Look at this." The file contained everything. Fake invoices designed to discredit her father's work, a list of city inspectors who could be influenced to find code violations, even contact information for a journalist who specialized in exposing contractor fraud in exchange for advertising revenue. But it was the final document that made Victoria's knees buckle. A death certificate, her father's death certificate, with a handwritten note in the margin, "Natural conclusion. Stress-related cardiac event following business failure. No further action required." "He watched my father die," she whispered. "He planned it, executed it, and then filed away his death like it was just another successful project." Christopher's face had gone white as paper. "Victoria, I'm going to be sick. There's more." Her hands shook as she opened another folder. "Look at these dates. He's been doing this for years, Christopher. Dozens of families destroyed, and he's been signing your name to every authorization." Christopher sank into his uncle's leather chair, the weight of inherited guilt crushing him. "How many people hate me for things I never even knew happened? How many lives has he ruined while I thought I was building something better?" Victoria was about to answer when the sound of footsteps in the hallway made them both freeze. The executive suite's outer door opened with a decisive click, and Richard Whitman's voice carried clearly through the office. "Margaret, cancel my 2 o'clock. I forgot some documents I need for the planning meeting." Victoria and Christopher looked at each other in panic. They were trapped in Richard's inner office with stolen files spread across his desk, and the man himself was walking directly toward them. "The closet," Christopher whispered, pointing to a door Victoria had assumed led to a bathroom. They grabbed what documents they could and dove into the narrow supply closet just as Richard's footsteps reached his office door. Through the crack in the closet door, Victoria could see him clearly for the first time. A tall, silver-haired man in his 60s with the kind of confident bearing that came from decades of getting away with murder. Richard moved to his desk and immediately noticed the disturbed files. His face darkened as he took in the scattered papers, the open filing cabinets, the obvious signs of intrusion. "Interesting," he murmured to himself, picking up James Sterling's photo. "Very interesting indeed." Victoria felt Christopher tense beside her as his uncle walked directly toward the closet. Her heart hammered so loudly she was sure Richard could hear it through the door. But instead of opening the closet, Richard moved to his phone and dialed a number from memory. "It's me," he said when someone answered. "We have a problem. Someone's been through the Sterling files." "Yes, I'm sure." "No, it has to be someone with building access. There are only 3 people who know about Sterling Construction, and 2 of them are dead." Victoria's blood turned to ice. 2 of them are dead. Her father and who else? "I don't care what it costs," Richard continued. Find out who's been asking questions about old business, and make sure they understand the consequences of curiosity. The same way we handled that lawyer who got too interested in the Patterson demolition. Christopher grabbed Victoria's hand in the darkness, his grip tight enough to hurt. They both understood what they were hearing. Richard Whitman wasn't just destroying businesses. He was eliminating people who got too close to the truth. Monday morning, I want a full security audit, Richard was saying. And Margaret, if anyone comes asking about files from 2018 or 2019, especially anything related to small contractors, you call me immediately. We can't afford any more complications. The call ended, and Richard began methodically putting his files back in order. But Victoria could see him making mental notes, cataloging exactly what had been disturbed. He knew someone was onto him, and he was already planning his response. After what felt like hours, Richard finally left his office, locking the door behind him. Victoria and Christopher remained frozen in the closet for another 10 minutes before Christopher's phone buzzed with a text. Uncle Richard asked me to work late tonight. Something about a security review. Margaret. He knows, Victoria whispered as they finally emerged from hiding. He doesn't know it's us yet, but he knows someone's investigating. Christopher nodded grimly. Which means we're running out of time. Victoria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. She looked into his eyes, seeing fear and determination in equal measure. Before you found out about my uncle, before you knew any of this, were you planning to destroy me? His voice was steady, but she could see the vulnerability underneath. Is that why you really took this job? Victoria felt the moment crystallize around them, understanding that her answer would determine not just their immediate future, but whether trust could ever exist between them again. Yes, she said simply. I came here to destroy your company and everyone in it. I wanted to watch you lose everything the way my father did. Christopher absorbed the blow without flinching. And now, Victoria looked at the evidence scattered around them, thought about the genuine pain in his voice when he talked about making amends, remembered the way he'd looked when he realized what had been done in his name. Now I want to help you burn it all down, she said. Every lie, every cover-up, every life your uncle destroyed. I want to drag it all into the light and make sure he pays for what he did. Even if it means destroying the legitimate parts of the company, even if it means dozens of innocent people lose their jobs. Even then, Victoria stepped closer to him, close enough to see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. My father deserves justice, Christopher. All of their victims deserve justice. And maybe we both deserve a chance to build something new from the ashes. Christopher reached up and cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away tears she didn't realize had fallen. Then we do this together. All the way to the end. Together, she agreed, and when he leaned down to kiss her, it tasted like promises and justice and the dangerous hope that sometimes the most broken things could be made beautiful again. But as they gathered the evidence that would destroy Richard Whitman's empire, neither of them noticed the security camera in the corner of the office, or the red light that indicated it had been recording everything. Sometimes the moment you choose love over revenge is exactly when the real battle begins. What would you risk to stand with someone against impossible odds? The security footage reached Richard Whitman's desk at 6 a.m. Friday morning, along with a cup of black coffee and the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd spent 40 years staying 3 steps ahead of his enemies. He watched the grainy video of his nephew and Victoria Sterling kissing in his office, surrounded by stolen evidence, and allowed himself a small smile. Nephew, he murmured, pausing the footage on Christopher's face. You always were too trusting. By 7 a.m., Richard had made 3 phone calls. By 8 a.m., Victoria's building superintendent was apologetically explaining that her apartment had suffered a gas leak and would need to be evacuated immediately for safety inspections. By 9 a.m., Christopher's personal assistant was informing him that his uncle had called an emergency board meeting to discuss serious security breaches and personnel issues. Victoria arrived at Whitman Industries to find her keycard deactivated and building security waiting to escort her out. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the guard said with genuine sympathy. "Orders from upstairs. You're not to enter the building pending an internal investigation." Christopher's phone went straight to voicemail. Her apartment was sealed off with hazmat tape. Victoria Sterling, Harvard law graduate, daughter of James Sterling, woman who'd spent 3 years planning her revenge, found herself standing on a Seattle sidewalk with nothing but the clothes on her back and photocopies of evidence that suddenly felt worthless against the full weight of Whitman power. But Victoria had learned something in the past month that Richard Whitman hadn't counted on. She wasn't alone anymore. The text came from an unknown number at 10:30 a.m. Pike Place Market. The original Starbucks. "Come alone. A friend." She found Christopher at a corner table, looking haggard but determined. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd been up all night, but his jaw was set with the kind of resolution she'd never seen from him before. "Your uncle moved fast," she said, sliding into the chair across from him. "Faster than I expected, but not faster than I prepared for." Christopher pushed a leather messenger bag across the table to her. "Everything's in there. Bank records, communication logs, digital copies of every file we found yesterday, plus things I've been collecting for months without realizing what I was looking at." Victoria opened the bag to find meticulously organized evidence that went far beyond what they'd discovered in Richard's office. "Christopher, this is enough to destroy him completely." His voice carried a weight she'd never heard before. "I spent all night in the company servers, following digital breadcrumbs I'd ignored for years. Victoria, he didn't just destroy your father. He's been systematically targeting minority-owned businesses across the Pacific Northwest for over a decade. The Patterson demolition he mentioned yesterday? That was a community center in Tacoma. The family that owned it died in a car accident 3 days after they refused to sell." Victoria's hands trembled as she flipped through the evidence. "He's been murdering people. And I've been signing the checks that paid for it." Christopher's voice cracked. "Every business account, every shell company, every payoff to corrupt officials, it all traces back to funds I authorized because I trusted him." "You didn't know." "I should have known." He looked out the window at Elliott Bay, where morning fog was lifting to reveal the city her father had loved. "I should have asked more questions, demanded more oversight, been less trusting and more suspicious. My ignorance doesn't make me innocent, Victoria." She reached across the table and took his hand. "No, but your actions from this point forward can make you redeemed." Christopher turned back to her, hope and fear warring in his expression. "The board meeting is in an hour. He's going to paint me as mentally unstable, claim I've been manipulated by a vengeful employee with a personal agenda. He'll strip me of control of the company and have me committed for evaluation before the day is over. Then we don't give him the chance." Victoria pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized years ago. "Seattle Times Investigative Desk? This is Victoria Sterling. I have a story for you that's going to change everything." The next 6 hours moved like a carefully choreographed dance. While Richard Whitman presented his case to the board of directors, complete with security footage and a psychological evaluation he'd commissioned from a doctor he'd been paying for years, Victoria and Christopher were across town in a conference room with 3 investigative journalists, 2 FBI agents, and a prosecutor from the Washington State Attorney General's office. By 3 p.m., federal agents were entering Whitman Industries with search warrants for every computer, file cabinet, and bank record in the building. By 4 p.m., Richard Whitman was being read his rights in front of the board of directors who'd been ready to hand him control of the company an hour earlier. By 5 p.m., Christopher was standing in front of news cameras, his voice steady as he announced his resignation as CEO and the immediate liquidation of Whitman Industries' assets to establish a victim compensation fund. Victoria watched from the crowd of reporters, her heart breaking and soaring simultaneously as the man she'd fallen in love with voluntarily destroyed everything he'd inherited to do what was right. "The Whitman name has caused enough pain," he said, looking directly into the cameras. "It's time for it to end." 3 months later, Victoria found Christopher in the small office above a coffee shop in Pioneer Square, surrounded by legal documents and architectural plans. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the organized chaos of someone building something entirely new. Sterling Community Development, she read from the business license on his desk. You named it after my father. It seemed right. Christopher looked up from the housing proposal he'd been reviewing. A company dedicated to supporting minority-owned contractors and building affordable housing. James Sterling's vision, just 23 years late. Victoria moved to the window, looking out at the construction site across the street where the first Sterling Community Development project was taking shape. 30 units of affordable housing, built entirely by contractors who'd been systematically excluded from major projects for years. The FBI called this morning, she said. They found evidence linking your uncle to 12 suspicious deaths over the past 15 years. He's never getting out of prison. Good. Christopher's voice carried no regret. How are you doing with all of this? Really? Victoria considered the question. 3 months ago, she'd been consumed by rage and plans for revenge. Now she was working as legal counsel for a company that employed 47 people and had a waiting list of contractors eager to participate in their projects. I think my father would be proud, she said finally. Not of the revenge I planned, but of what we built instead. Christopher stood and moved to join her at the window. I dream about him sometimes. Your father. I dream that I get to meet him and apologize for what was done in my name. What does he say in these dreams? That apologies don't build houses. That the only thing that matters is what we do with the time we have left. Victoria leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Outside their window, construction workers, including several who'd been blacklisted by the old Whitman Industries, were raising the frame of what would become someone's first home. Christopher. Yeah. I love you. The words came easily now, without the weight of deception or the shadow of revenge. Not because you're trying to make amends, not because of what you lost or what you're building. Just because you're you. He turned and pulled her into his arms, his kiss tasting like coffee and hope and the particular sweetness that comes from choosing each other despite everything that should have kept them apart. I love you too, he murmured against her lips. James Sterling's daughter. The woman who saved me from becoming my family's legacy. Through the window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the construction site where a new kind of future was taking shape. Built on the foundation of justice served, trust earned, and the radical possibility that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most broken ground. Victoria thought of her father, whose photo now sat on Christopher's desk next to their business license, and whispered a promise to the Seattle sky. We did it, Daddy. We built something worth believing in. 6 months later, at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the James Sterling Memorial Housing Complex, Victoria Sterling and Christopher Whitman would announce their engagement to a crowd of residents, contractors, and community leaders who understood that some love stories are really stories about justice finding its way home. But that afternoon in their sunlit office, surrounded by plans for a better future, they simply held each other and watched their shared dream take shape one beam, one nail, one act of faith at a time. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't destroying your enemy. It's discovering they were never your enemy at all. Do you believe love and justice can rebuild what hatred destroyed?
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.